I shouldn't have stayed in the stairwell, but I did. When you work nights, you learn which doors stick and which people avoid eye contact. That night, the building smelled like burnt coffee and wet concrete, and I heard my neighbor's voice through the half-open landing door. I'm Luis, 40, warehouse shift lead. I count days by paycheck dates and the cost of diapers, not by calendars. My wife's been out of work for months, so I pick up extra hours and pretend I'm fine. The only thing I can afford to be is quiet. That's what I told myself when I heard Mr. Havel from 4B talking like he was rehearsing a confession. He wasn't loud, he wasn't panicked. He sounded calm, like he was explaining something to someone who already agreed. I only meant to grab my package, but I paused because he said her name. Not my wife's, not mine. Marisol. The girl who sometimes comes by with a little lunch bag for him. A second voice answered, low and impatient. They discussed a folder, something digital, and a pattern of payments. The words were ordinary, but the way he said Marisol's name made my stomach drop. Then I heard the key detail, the part everyone else in our building pretends not to notice. Marisol started coming after he got new locks. People called it security. I called it weird. I saw her once, eyes down, wearing a cheap coat in warm weather, like she was trying to vanish. I told myself, someone's personal situation, mind your business. But then Mr. Havel said, she can sign anything once I fix the numbers. He said it like it was a favor, like her mistakes were a math problem. The other voice asked about her ID, and he replied that it was already updated. He said updated, not replaced. I stepped back so fast I hit the railing. My package slipped and thunked on the stair. They went silent. I froze with my thumb on the doorframe, listening to breathing that did not sound like sharing secrets. It sounded like bargaining. I walked out like nothing happened, but my hands shook in my work gloves. At the end of my shift, I opened the building directory app to look up Marisol's name, then shut it down because I couldn't explain why I was searching. That's what guilt does. It makes you invent reasons. All morning, I kept seeing her lunch bag, the way she smiled at the mail slots like she was practicing. I tried to focus on inventory counts, but every time my scanner beeped, I thought of Mr. Havel saying numbers, updated. If what I heard was true, it meant someone was using her identity to keep a private agreement alive, and she did not even get a real choice. I told myself not to touch it. I'm not a hero. I'm not trained. If I'm wrong, I ruin someone's life. If I'm right, I risk my job, my housing, my wife's fragile hope. I imagined the stairwell door swinging open and Mr. Havel looking at me like I'd broken a deal he needed. By lunch, my phone felt heavier than my tools. I finally called Marisol's number from the directory, and it went to voicemail. I left a message I hated saying I heard something in the building and that she should be careful. Then I deleted it because it sounded like a threat. That evening, my neighbor stood outside the laundry room, pretending to sort coins from a pocket. I watched him from the vending machine reflection. He glanced up, slow, like he'd been waiting for someone to notice. He didn't ask if I heard. He said, "You were in the stairwell, weren't you, Louise?" I felt my mouth go dry. I told him I was getting my package. He smiled without warmth and said, "Packages can be tracked?" Then he stepped closer and lowered his voice. He told me to stay out of her business and that he'd make sure my family was protected. Protected? Like a leash. I did the thing I feared. I went home, sat at the table under a flickering bulb, and opened a folder on my own work laptop that I'd kept since last year, a list of transactions I'd pulled for a surprise audit. Nobody asked for it. I saved it because I didn't like blind trust. I wrote down what I heard, the exact words, the stairwell timing, the way the second voice hesitated. Then I sent it anonymously through a form on a local housing support site. No names, no accusations, just a request to verify identity changes tied to lease paperwork and payment schedules. 2 days later, Marisol knocked on my door. She looked smaller than I remembered. She held a thin stack of papers, official letters with dates. She didn't cry. She just stared at me like she was trying to decide if I was real. She said someone corrected her records. She said her name was still hers. She said she thought she was trapped in a misunderstanding because everyone kept telling her to be grateful. Mr. Havel showed up the next week, furious. demanding I open the door and explain myself. He told my wife I was meddling. He said he'd heard I worked overtime, and he implied he could make sure that stopped. I didn't answer him. I stood behind the peephole and let the silence do its job. The building manager quietly replaced the locks again, without speeches. I didn't get thanked. I didn't get paid. But my wife got interviews because she finally felt safe enough to say her real name on forms without flinching. What keeps me awake is not the fear. It's the moment I knew I could have walked away. A confession is not only what you tell others, it's what you refuse to ignore when you hear the truth breathing through a wall.